Hello there! Have you ever wondered why Veterans Day parades always start at 11 o'clock in the morning? We'll learn that more and more about today's Veterans Day celebration. What's it all about? Here on today's episode of the State of Greater Western New York Report. It's brought to you by... Each week, our community makes history. Each week, you make history. And each week, there's only one source to turn to for the first take on history. You know what that is? Subscribe to the Sentinel right now to discover the history being made in your own backyard. The Bend and Honeoye Falls Lima Sentinel. More than just your news, it's your history. Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the State of Greater Western New York Report. Join us each episode as we discuss fantastic topics ranging from history to science to the strange and the wonderful, as well as the treasured spirit with which our region has infused America. We challenge you to consider all things Greater Western New York, from our region's very beginnings to how it inspires, how it empowers, and why it is so admired. Here's the host of the State of Greater Western New York Report, Chris Carosa. Welcome again to the State of Greater Western New York Report. I'm Chris Carosa, and we have a very special episode today because today is November 11th, and it's Veterans Day. And Veterans Day is a time when we pay respect to all those who have served and continue to serve our nation in the armed forces. Well, Veterans Day has a very interesting history, and you have to go back a long ways to get to the very beginning of it. In fact, how far back do you have to go? Well, some say you have to go back as far, really, as the ancient Greeks, because the ancient Greeks really start what we might call the romanticism of war, the mythology that war is a thing that, well, that is appealing in some ways. I mean, it's appealing in the sense where it can help protect you, but it also has some bad stuff associated with it. But the beginning, really, of this romanticization of war, maybe you can get that with the Battle of Thermopylae in the early years BC, where 300 Spartans stood up against tens of thousands of Persians in a narrow pass, and they lost. They got killed, all of them, and there's been movies made about it. But what they did is they held back the invading forces for a long enough period of time to allow the rest of the Greek city-states to band together and then come up with a defense that worked. Even if you go back to ancient Rome and the idea that there's a certain honor to battle, and it's there, but it was ruthless in ancient Rome too, and you have no farther to look than Carthage itself. Carthage, which is depicted here, was once a vibrant trading port on the Mediterranean Sea that was totally wiped out by Rome because they were kind of jealous of what's going on. Moving ahead a little further, it wasn't just fighting for the emperor that made war romantic, but then it was also fighting for God, and the Crusades is really a place where we see that occurring, where it was honorable to go ahead and fight, and everyone would want, in fact, they would be expected to fight for their God. Now, the sense that it's a just limited to God isn't really true. In fact, it was also part of the world itself. It was, the European world, this Chivalric Code kind of put together this idea that there was this honor in fighting, and that it was romantic in a way. But don't forget, this was hand-to-hand battle, and it was sometimes ruthless, but it was mano a mano, and that was another popular kind of perception that people had of battle, and that you would go and you would do the honorable thing, you would fight honorably. Yes, people would die, but it wasn't always, what we see war of as today. That was about to change. And you might think that the very first changes might have occurred with the Revolutionary War, because there the American patriots did not fight by these gentlemanly rules that so often you saw in the European battles. In fact, one of the things that they were immediately criticized for by their British counterparts was the tendency to fight in guerrilla-like tactics. So they wouldn't necessarily go in a line. They were kind of disheveled in that, but they did fight in lines. But here's what they did that was really, quote-unquote, improper. They aimed for the leaders, the generals, the people who were in charge of the battle. And that really wasn't supposed to happen. You were not supposed to engage in warfare in such a crude manner. You had to respect the aristocracy that were the leaders. And of course, the American troops didn't do that. It didn't take long, however, for America to kind of adopt this European sense of warfare. And in fact, if you look at the first Battle of Manassas, the Battle of Bull Run, which is the first battle in the Civil War, it was considered a form of entertainment. People actually went out there and picnicked with each other as this war occurred. And that would be unheard of now, but at the time, at the beginning of the Civil War, it really wasn't considered that big of a deal, ironically. It didn't take much time thereafter to realize that, this is not a typical war in the sense where you have this romantic notion. There were lots and lots of deaths, lots and lots of casualties. You look at something like Pickett's Charge depicted here in the Battle of Gettysburg, where the Confederates ran down this roughly mile-long hill, open field, and there was no cover. They were pure targets. Pickett's Charge was a classic military maneuver that was an ultimate failure in the face of what was becoming modern warfare. Of course, the worst of it was the Battle of Chickamauga, which had the highest casualty rate of all during the Civil War. So America itself kind of understood very quickly, or earlier maybe than the European counterparts, what exactly was going on with this war and why maybe it wasn't necessarily something that you would want to engage in properly. And maybe that's the reason why in World War I, the Americans were a little late to come into things. It was really more of a European sort of thing, as we see in the newspaper headlines depicted here, where there was excitement after the Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated to bring everybody together in these wars. And it was, again, this romantic notion of going into battle and honoring whatever it is that you're honoring. At this point, it was really mostly diplomatic treaties that you were honoring more than anything else. But the war became nasty, and you see that headline, the Lusitania, a civilian ship, was sunk, and it was shortly thereafter that America came into the war, and about a year later, things turned around. And this is where we get into the kind of the beginnings of what ended up becoming Armistice Day. You have to realize that this battle, what was going on in World War I, while it started off as this romantic notion, really devolved very quickly into trench warfare. And trench warfare, you would come out of the trenches and charge. So in a way, it was sort of like Pickett's Charge, where you were on this open battlefield. And by that time, machine guns were, a normal sort of thing in war. And you just couldn't have a charge and survive. And together with chemical warfare and tanks, and even the advent of airplanes, even though airplanes were really used for reconnaissance more than any sort of offensive kind of maneuvers, mainly. They were used for some bombings, but that didn't really come about until World War II. But in World War I, so you had this really bad feeling of what was going on during the war, and there was a sense that when it would end, there would be a massive celebration. And that's really the start of what we're talking about today. So it began towards the mid-November of 1918 when people were discussing a truce. And that truce was really discussed in a way that it was agreed to before it would happen. So they agreed to the truce, and the truce would occur on November 11th at 11 o'clock in the morning. And here's the little piece of paper that the troops are being informed that this armistice is going to occur. And once the armistice occurred, or once word of it occurred, people began to celebrate, but they kept their eyes on their watches because they knew that before 11 o'clock, they could have been fired on. It wasn't until after 11 o'clock that things would quiet down and everybody would be happy. So once that hour was reached, there was massive celebration, not only among the troops in the field, but also throughout the world. Civilians would celebrate. Everyone, there would be parades. There was a much celebration in the world. Now the interesting thing here is that the celebration, there was no stated armistice day at this time. It was just an armistice day. It took about a year for the Treaty of Versailles to be signed. So the true peace didn't occur until about a year later. Nonetheless, the war had ended, and this meant a reason for celebration. Now, how bad was World War I? Well, if you recall how bad the Civil War was in terms of a generation of American men being wiped out, the same thing happened across Europe in World War I. Germany, France, Austria, even Britain. There was a lost generation where women outnumbered the men in this generation because so many men had been killed in action. And most of the men in Britain were unmarried men. So that made things worse in terms of moving forward in the nation. So we don't have Armistice Day yet. So where do we actually get it? Where does Armistice Day come about? Well, we're going to find out the answer to that question in a moment after we take this commercial break. Through the mists of time, nature and man have both created and buried treasures beyond the imagination. With the ages, these riches slowly dissolve into mere myths until they are forever forgotten. But there are those brave souls who tirelessly cling to the truth, ever seeking to discover the undiscovered, to reveal what has always been there, to uncover the hidden gems of a land thought forsaken but loved by millions. 50 Hidden Gems of Greater Western New York. Discover the secrets in your own backyard. Buy your copy now at 50hiddengems.com. Hi, and welcome back to the state of Greater Western New York, where today, Veterans Day, November 11th, we're talking about the history of Veterans Day and how it came about. Where we left off was the formal signing of the armistice on to take effect on November 11th at 11 o'clock in 1918, which ends hostilities of the First World War, which, by the way, at the time it wasn't called the First World War. It was called the War to End All Wars, the Great War, the World War. It was felt that it was so devastating that it would be a singular event, and we would never see anything at that level occur in the world again. More on that in a moment. But first, let's get back to 1918, when the armistice was officially signed and enacted. That didn't really create the formal peace treaty. That was going to happen a little bit later. And here we see Woodrow Wilson with his cabinet in 1918. He got together with members of the powers to come up with the Treaty of Versailles, and that is what formally ended the war in 1919. So 1919 is when this treaty was signed, and Wilson really was jubilant about the fact he had a lot of things in his head about what he wanted to do going forward. We now know that one of those was the League of Nations, which really flunked, so that wasn't that big of a that wasn't very successful. But on the 11th of November in 1919, by that time, by the way, Woodrow Wilson had suffered what would become a debilitating stroke. The nation didn't know, and he didn't make any formal speeches. But there was an address that he issued that was on the anniversary of the signing of the armistice with Germany. And this is what Wilson said. He said, "A year ago today, our enemies laid down their arms in accordance with an armistice which rendered them impotent to renew hostilities, and gave the world an assured opportunity to reconstruct its shattered order and work out in peace a new and juster set of international relations. The soldiers and people of the European allies had fought and endured for more than 4 years to uphold the barrier of civilization against the aggressions of armed force. We ourselves had been in the conflict something more than a year and a half. With splendid forgetfulness of mere personal concerns, we remodeled our industries, concentrated our financial resources, increased our agricultural output, and assembled a great army, so that at last our power was a decisive factor in the victory. We were able to bring the vast resources, material and moral, of a great and free people to the assistance of our associates in Europe, who had suffered and sacrificed without limit in the cause for which we fought. Out of this victory there arose new possibilities of political freedom and economic concert. The war showed us the strength of great nations acting together for high purposes, and the victory of arms foretells the enduring conquests which can be made in peace when nations act justly and in furtherance of the common interests of men." And here's the important part now. To us in America, the Reflections of Armistice Day will be filled with solemn pride in the heroism of those who died in the country's service, and with gratitude for the victory, both because of the thing from which it has freed us, and because of the opportunity it has given America to show her sympathy with peace and justice in the councils of nations. So that was Woodrow Wilson a year after the first Armistice Day, the actual Armistice Day. But it wasn't an official holiday. It was just a one-time event, and that was it. It was one and done. So when did we actually get the point where we could see an Armistice Day occurring? Well, that didn't come about until several years later, when Congress passed a law or a bill pretty much asking Calvin Coolidge, the then president, to proclaim every November 11th as Armistice Day, a day of remembrance. And it was unlike what was being celebrated at the time, Decoration Day, which was a national day of remembrance for all those killed in the Civil War. They wanted to have something that would recognize those in the First World War. And so that was Armistice Day. It did not become a legal holiday until May 13th, 1938. And then its official name became Armistice Day. It was to honor and remember all those who served during the Great War. So that was May 13th, 1938. Just a little over a year later, in Poland, the Germans and the Russians decided that there should be no more Poland, and they started what would eventually be called World War II. And that was an even more devastating war between D-Day and the Pacific Island hopping. A lot of Americans lost their lives, and by the end of the war, it was pretty obvious that we should honor them too. And that's when this movement to change Armistice Day from honoring just World War I veterans to honoring World War II, in fact, all American veterans, came about. And ultimately, that was passed on June 1st, 1994 in Congress. Actually, the bill was passed on May 26th, 1994. And Dwight Eisenhower is pictured here instructing troops on D-Day, would later become president, and he would be the one who would actually sign that into law on May 26, 1954. About a week later, Congress amended the bill. And at that point, they changed the name from the word armistice to veterans. So armistice was really associated with World War I. And they wanted to broaden this honor to include all servicemen. And that was why they used the word veteran. So it became Veterans Day. Now, a funny thing happened shortly after that. Not really shortly after that, but in 1970, there was this thing that was passed that was called the Uniform Monday Holiday Act. And what that did is it changed the days we would celebrate certain holidays from a fixed day of the month to an actually day of the week, Monday, so we would have longer holidays. So that would include things like, say, Memorial Day and Columbus Day, and it also included Veterans Day. Well, here's the really weird part about it, is that Veterans Day was celebrated on November 11th at 11 o'clock for obvious reasons. There was an association with that day and time. When did they move this new celebration? They moved it to the fourth Monday of October. Why would Veterans Day be moved to October? Well, that's what they did, and it turned out that that was not really accepted very well, and so shortly thereafter, it was moved back to a fixed date of November 11th every year. So there we go. That's our history of Veterans Day, and again, we want to take this time to really show our respect and thank all those who've served the nation at any time, in any way, for the sacrifices that they've made and for the legacy that really they leave behind in showing the importance of loyalty, of honor, of integrity, the sort of things that really were ideal. Going back to the founding of America, supporting those ideals, those thoughts, as Woodrow Wilson said, the moral assets as well. So again, thank you for listening today. Thank you for being part of this celebration, and we wish everyone to do something today that's special, that pays respects in an honorable way to those who have served their country. So with that, I want to thank everybody for listening, and we'll see you next week.